Yeah, thanks for having us. We're really excited to talk today about tales from the real world. I'm joined by my colleague Shreya Potham. She's field CTO at Wiz, and she's got a ton of experience in this space. And so, really looking forward to sharing some of that background as well as some of our experiences and how organizations can actually shift left. So, before we jump into that, a little bit of introductions. I'm Jung Liu. I lead the product marketing team at Wiz, and I'm joined by my colleague Shreya. Shreya, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Sriya. Excuse me, sorry. I'm field CTO at Wiz, and a lot of what I do is helping customers after they've purchased and helping them transform their cloud security programs. Before Wiz, I was a principal cloud security architect at United Airlines, where I took United through some of this transformation, like helping us shift a little further left.
Awesome. So, just to kick us off a little bit here, when we think about cloud, it really is the biggest transformation that the info security team has experienced really in our entire lifetimes. And it's really changed a lot of things for all of us that are building and securing the cloud environment in a number of different ways. The first is that the environment itself is very different. It's very decentralized, right? Dev teams, business units, they make the decisions on what technology they're going to bring into the environment. And so as a result, organizations can very quickly end up in highly complex, ever-changing environments that are comprised of virtual machines, containerized environments, serverless. It could span multiple clouds. And oftentimes there's hundreds, if not thousands, of technologies that are being used in order to support that environment. And so, as folks that care about security of this cloud environment, it's really difficult for us to get visibility into that dynamic environment. The second key thing is that the risks are different as well. When you start from the cloud, everything is born with an IP address. And so exposure is incredibly simple in the cloud, but actually finding the real risks, the critical risks that create attack paths to crown jewels in your organization is actually very, very difficult, as we continue to hear in the news on a weekly basis. And so it's difficult for teams to really prioritize what's important and eliminate the noise of finding things that are not important. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, the ownership model is different, right? Dev teams, those business units, they are making decisions. They are tip of the spear in terms of picking out technologies. And so how do we enable them to continue to move fast while staying secure as an organization? And as a few examples of this, this is some data around just the number of APIs that AWS has made available. You can see it's grown at this exponential rate. And this is super exciting for all of us that build in the cloud because this is just a lot of innovation that is available to us to make better customer experiences or to help drive better business outcomes. But at the same time, all of this agility also introduces more attack surface. And this is just one cloud for many organizations, right? They're looking at multiple clouds, lots of different technologies beyond just AWS as a provider. And the other key part of this is really around exposure being a really key risk in the cloud. And you see this with really large organizations, right? Our CSPs themselves, Amazon, Microsoft, they are faced with this risk all the time. And we've done some interesting research that shows that the pace of exposure is also happening at an unprecedented rate as well. So if you have an S3 bucket and it's referenced within a public GitHub repo, the amount of time it takes for an attacker to find that open bucket is 7 hours or less, right? So really, it's important to understand these risks. And this is also where shifting left comes into place, because why do we keep finding these security incidents in production, right? We want to find this much earlier in the process when it's less costly to our business. And there's some great research that Google has done, which shows that if you can successfully shift security left, you can see an 82% reduction in defects in the production environment. So how do we go about making that happen, right? In many ways, we need to think about cloud security in a different way, and we have to think about a new operating model for how it works within an organization. And we really think about cloud security as a team sport across every person in an organization that's building in the cloud. And we really need to think about development and security teams understanding and controlling risks together across the pipeline. And we see a few different models for this. The first is the security team needs to have that centralized visibility into everything that's happening in the environment. And it has to be unconditional, right? They can't rely on a team to say, oh, hey, we saw that AWS released this cool new database service, so we just started using it. Like the security team can't rely on the dev team telling them that to know that it exists, right? We need to have that same foundation of visibility across all of our teams. And our dev teams need the ability to move really fast, right? And they need the ability to self-service, understand risks in their environment. We can't rely on them always being in a security tool because no one has time for that, really. And we need them to have guardrails so that they're able to move quickly, but still in a secure way. So when I talk about guardrails, I like to use this analogy here, Formula One, right? Our developers, they're doing amazing things, they're innovating, they're moving really fast, and we want to keep them moving really fast. But we also want to help put some guardrails in place, which are really these railings, right? Which is on a normal day-to-day basis, it shouldn't impact your developer substantially, right? It's really there in the event that something catastrophic happens to protect everyone. And that's how we like to think about guardrails here at Wiz. Now, when we think about cloud security, there's a ton of different use cases that are actually out there. And so when you think about having to shift security left, you have to think about the different components and the different risks that you're looking at. So some of them may be at the architecture level. So for example, thinking about container security, for example. Other pieces might be around different types of risks that you have to be aware of in the cloud. So different types of vulnerabilities, different types of misconfigurations, identity issues that might be in a KIM solution, compliance, secret scanning. The list really goes on and on. There's a number of different use cases. And when you think about shifting left, you have to think about all of these things holistically, because oftentimes, as we're seeing from the attacks that are out there, it's not usually just a single risk factor that creates a critical risk, but a combination of different things that leads to a full attack path into something like sensitive data or an important admin role in your organization. And as an example of how we think about this even further, if we drill down into the container security use case in particular, when you think about shifting left, again, there's a lot of different pieces to think about. So starting all the way from the right, that's your runtime environment. You have to understand, scan, and monitor all of the running containers. And then as you shift left, there's different pieces that you have to think about as well. So if we move all the way to the left at the code point in time, this is where you're looking at scanning infrastructure as code templates to understand what risk might present itself. In the build and store phase, you're scanning container images and container registries as well to understand what is happening in them. And then in the deploy phase, you might be using things like an admission controller to actually enforce those guardrails and block risks from being deployed into the runtime environment. So when we think about shifting left, there's not just a single thing that we have to think about. There's a lot of complexity to it and a lot of moving pieces. And so when we think about shifting left, it really requires a foundation to be established within an organization. And I think there's no better person to tell us about this than Shreya, who did this at United and also advises a number of our customers on how to do this effectively.
Thanks, John. So let's talk about some prerequisites that we're looking at when we're talking about shifting left. And the first 2 points here are, I think, the real foundation, the stuff that you definitely need to address, which is culture. Without having a culture where everyone agrees that security is important, it's really difficult to enable developer freedom through automation. And the first point here is trust, right? The first thing I ask teams as they're starting down this journey, and the first thing that I asked myself was, what is our relationship with the development team? Are we actually working together? Is security and development going down a shared path, a shared goal? And you'd be surprised at how many organizations start with no. And I think that's the first thing that you really need to address. This model works really beautifully when your developers also have the trust that security isn't going to slow them down, and that we're just enabling development teams to do their work and actually do it more securely. Security teams want to know that developers are following the golden path and they're following the security guidelines and guardrails that we're putting in place. We also want to make sure that developers have that security-minded culture. No one is building applications so that they can get hacked. So we want to make sure that the dev teams and the broader organization cares about and wants to implement security. Organizations that are able to achieve this have a much better outcome and are able to create a shared goal between the security and dev teams, which is, again, like setting that foundational culture. Once you have that squared away, then we start taking a look at the actual environment. What resources do you have available? How are your applications being shipped? What security policies do you have in place? Something that Jong and I were talking about when we were planning this talk was that you really have to look right so that you're able to shift left. So you want to have the visibility into your environment and understanding, again, what's deployed. And then we can start actually cleaning up prod and, more importantly, the scripts that build prod so that the automation that we're putting in place doesn't break. Amongst a lot of organizations that I've worked with, there's very rarely a singular pipeline solution used and almost never a singular team that manages all of the pipelines for the entire organization. So this not only means that shifting left requires a big cultural change and requires a lot of teams to be bought into the idea of shifting left, but it's also, you have like more of a tactical problem too, right? How do you get to all of those teams and how do you get into every single app and pipeline that you're building? And sometimes it takes months to actually fully roll out a pipeline tool and make sure that everyone understands the new process and is actually able to adhere to it. And finally, once we have all of this squared away, then we actually focus on the guardrail itself. What are teams trying to evaluate in your pipeline? And I find that oftentimes it's a balance between everything, right? You want to evaluate all the security and actually just the worst of the worst, things that you never, ever want to be shipped into production. And that really just depends on your organization and what you're expecting your security posture to be. And then I'd like to talk about actually the best practices on the next slide and what it takes to make it happen. So I think the first thing, again, is aligning and communicating. Implementing shift left and moving into the pipeline is, again, like we've discussed, a large organizational change, and you want to make sure that your leadership understands what you're doing and is on board to make those changes as well. When moving in this direction at United, it was really important for me to not only have the CISO's buy-in and like my leadership, but also make sure that her peers and all of the application team leadership in the business was understood and was bought into this idea as well. So they not only understood my expectations of the dev teams, but also were able to encourage and expect their teams to meet the new process as well. And then again, we're getting our teams on board, making sure that we're communicating to the actual doers and establishing those baseline guardrails. Once we have that done, we can start measuring, right? How are our templates performing against where we want to be? A lot of the time when you're starting out doing shift left, you have a lot of security debt, things that aren't necessarily adherent to the current policies that you have in place. So this is a part of that cleanup process, and it's also maybe designing that exceptions process as well. And from here, we learn and iterate. The third step is actually creating that enforcement and actually making it a harder technical guardrail and enforcing the guardrail in the pipeline. We're asking questions like, are we actually reducing the number of issues that our teams are creating? And are we actually finding and fixing those issues early and proactively? And as with any process, we want to continue to share and improve. A lot of organizations have a lot of success having knowledge groups internally and making sure that those teams are able to share their progress and how they're resolving some issues maybe. And we also want to make sure that we're improving our designs as well. So John was talking about how AWS has increased the number of APIs that they've used, that they've released, and we also want to make sure that we have the guardrails and the policies in place that we're actually able to effectively say that, yes, like the way that we're shipping our service is secure.
And Shreya, actually, just to chime in here, one of the things that I remember you telling me about that was interesting was how you really spent a lot of time in the measurement stage. Right? Can you talk a little bit more about, why that made sense for you and, kind of maybe like the success criteria that you were looking to have there before moving on?
Yeah. So again, when we're measuring, we're not necessarily enforcing, right? So we're making sure that what we are trying to do is achievable. We want to make sure that we're not setting unreasonable expectations, but also that we're creating and we're improving on the templates that we're running through a pipeline and making sure that they're actually able to achieve that expectation once we're actually enforcing things. And that often is like a breaking change, right? If you're actually saying like, hey, if this policy fails in the pipeline, then stop the pipeline and you're not able to ship. That's something that if you do without tact and you do kind of without planning, it's something that reduces the trust between your dev teams and security, because they once they realize, once they see that you're creating breaking changes for them, you're actually slowing them down. And two, it creates a lot of frustration and a lot of inefficiency. So we just want to make sure again that we're starting with a little bit of a clean slate, and you're actually able to kind of switch on a switch, right? And actually say yes, enforce, without having too many problems once you're at that stage. Awesome. Cool. So on the next slide, Andrew McKenna, an architect at Priceline, is talking about exactly this, right? He's talking about how it's changed for him once they were actually able to implement guardrails and shifting left. Priceline wanted to implement guardrails, and they wanted those guardrails to be invisible. So they didn't want the dev teams to kind of feel that friction within the pipeline. So now, once they have the guardrails built in, they're able to deploy securely and save teams time and don't need to kind of go back and forth on that issue in the future. Awesome. So let's talk about Wiz for a hot second. So Wiz connects to all of your cloud environments and is able to create a full network map of your infrastructure and also understand the services and identities that are used within your environment, all agentlessly. Once Wiz has, again, that network map and understands what is in your environment, we're actually identifying the risks within your environment as well. Things like misconfigurations, exposed secrets, vulnerabilities, excessive access, and most recently, actually the PII, actually sensitive data like PII, PCI, and PHI in your environment. Once we know where the risks are, we're actually able to map the attack paths within your cloud environment that makes it susceptible to a breach, so that teams are actually able to prioritize those attack paths. In this example, Wiz identified a VM that was critically exposed and had a critical network vulnerability with a known exploit, and also had access to a role which gave it access to some sensitive data there. Finally, once you actually understand the attack paths, you want to know who is able to actually fix that. Wiz allows you to identify and segment your environment based on infrastructure ownership, so you don't have to waste time finding the right person. So this could be things like business units, environments, or applications. And then finally, we actually want to make it easy for those teams to find that they have an issue and resolve them quickly. So we can send alerts to Slack, Jira, ServiceNow, and others, so that teams don't actually need to leave their workflow and are able to get the full context they need to resolve an issue. And finally, why we're all here is actually that shift left prevention. So once we have what's going on within the environment and are able to fix there, we enable you to shift left and use the same guardrails that you have within the environment, and extend those policies to the pipeline to prevent risky deployments from happening in the first place. And here's a little slide about Wiz. Wiz is trusted by over 35% of the Fortune 100, amongst the largest cloud environments in the world. We have customers from every industry, from tech to broadcasting, and companies like Salesforce and Snowflake, Morgan Stanley and Blackstone, and every other industry in between. Thank you.